So welcome everyone. I'm Leslie Belton Chevallier from Université Gustave Eiffel, and we are here today with Anne Aguilera, Université Gustave Eiffel as well, and Jean-Daniel Saphores from University of Irvine in California to talk then about the consumer side. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to present results of some of our researches about online shopping. More especially, we are here virtually to discuss the impacts of online shopping of material goods, such as grocery, and its growth on individual travel behavior and practices, both in France and in the USA. So the slideshow is not here. It would have been useful. You could go to slide 2 directly, I guess. You can give us the presentation mode. So, as you know, or as you can see on this slide, the growth of online shopping has been greatly accelerated by pandemic, especially for goods such as grocery products. So the trend of growth from many goods, but especially is grocery, has known a spectacular boom during pandemics. For example, you can see the figures for online sales, all types of goods and services, which grew by 32% in France in 2020. If we focus on food shopping, this is the same figures approximately. 31% of households bought food and beverage online in 2020, and 43% in the USA, versus approximately 10 to 15% the previous years. So you could go to the next slide, the third one, please. Thanks. As we speak about the impact of online shopping on travel and mobility, it is important to look at the delivery systems of goods. How do people collect the things they are buying online, and do they travel to collect them? In both countries, online shopping is characterized by various delivery systems in which travel of households are required or not. This system, the first one is home delivery, direct to home. The second one are pickup points in shops or lockers. And the third one is click and collect, that allows customers to go online and then go and collect at the physical store with a rendezvous or a picking time. In particular, in France, there has been a strong development of click and collect for grocery products in recent years. The system for the French grocery click and collect is called Drive and exists since 2010 approximately. This service has been designed by supermarket chains as a way to counteract progressive customers' dissatisfaction about their store and to counteract their loss of market shares at the time. So that being said, we could go on the fourth slide, please. Next one, if you can show us, maybe. So that being said, maybe the question of the impact of the growth of online shopping on individual travel behavior, especially shopping trips frequency and modal share, is not new. Nevertheless, existing literature shows contrasted results about this impact. Thanks, it's much better with that. In particular, so I start again. In particular, recent studies suggest that there is no obvious link, increase or decrease, between online shopping and travel behavior. Indeed, the use of online shopping or e-commerce is associated with new purchasing configuration between physical and online store, and also with transformation in the use of time, in the distribution of daily activities, and therefore of travel within households, especially between spouses. So nowadays, our main question are the following: what if the use of e-commerce and e-grocery become the new or the next normal, or will it affect travel? Will it change our previous results or not? It's important to investigate those questions with keeping in mind that shopping trips are the most frequent purpose of travel in many countries. So before just starting to present our results, we need to emphasize on our main difficulty in our research area. In fact, you could pass on the next slide, please, about methods. In fact, we are faced with a lack of data. Travel surveys doesn't investigate digital activities in depth. For example, the French household travel surveys don't ask a single question on digital equipment or on digital practices. The other limit of this survey are the period of time they are observing, a single day, which is not enough if you want to study shopping travels, which are more often performed on a weekdays for grocery or on longer periods, such as months for other products. We could use time use surveys, but they also have their limits. Other than the observed period, this survey do not capture trips and travel with enough precision. And at last, we could also use consumer surveys, but they doesn't investigate shopping trips with many details. So we could not measure the impact of shopping practices on mobility with those studies. So that being said, therefore, we have to build our own data sets with questionnaires and interviews of households, as you will see now with our results. I will present you now the methods we used on several studies we convey at the University Gustave Eiffel. We will talk more specifically about two researches which were conducted in 2014 and 2016, long before COVID, you will say. So you could pass on the next slideshow. Yeah. So these two original surveys were based both on questionnaires and face-to-face interviews in order to investigate the impact of online shopping, first in low-density areas, and secondly, the second survey was designed to measure the impact of click and pick-up for grocery products on purchasing practices and travel behavior. Voilà. So we built ad hoc questionnaires and we conducted face-to-face interviews with households, respectively. And then for the result, I will let Han speak.
Thank you very much, Laetitia. I will now present some of the results of these two research. So next slide, please. Thank you very much. A first result of this research is that if online shopping in general is relatively spread among the population, this is not the case for e-grocery. In the survey we made in 2016, we observed that e-grocery at that time was used only by 25% of French households. It should be more now, but I don't have the figures. Second result, so in addition, dual earner, highly educated and young households were overrepresented among e-grocery consumers. Another very important result of this research is that our two surveys show that online shopping is associated with new purchasing practices that more closely match temporary or more permanently the constraints faced by individuals. In particular, we highlight that women who have a job and who have children and have therefore to manage complex timetables are clearly overrepresented among e-grocery customers in France. Moreover, we observed that childbirth was a powerful driver of click and pick up adoption in France. More precisely, regarding the origin of time savings, our two surveys show very clearly that the practice of online shopping in general, so both online shopping for all types of goods or e-grocery shopping, it allows time savings because the purchase can be fragmented in time and also in space, and also because the pickup of the products, which is very rapid in case of grocery, so pickup, click and pickup stores. So it can be delegated to the spouse, or it can be scheduled in the late afternoon, especially when people return home after work. In the same way, regarding low densities areas, specifically, we observe that online purchasing practices aimed at coping with tight schedules, at compensating also for the distance to the city center, and they also aimed at avoiding trips that are considered useless, and also at avoiding, next slide please, at avoiding areas that were considered unpleasant by the inhabitants, such as the city centers. So city center is very far and city center is unpleasant because of density, pollution, noise, etc. So people try to avoid this area with online shopping. In addition, time savings through online shopping allow people to develop locally encouraged practices, including short circuits and itinerant shops. Finally, we demonstrated that e-grocery allowed a new fragmentation of products and then trips between what is purchased online and what is still purchased in physical stores. More precisely, our two research highlighted that physical stores were still perhaps more and more locations where people want to discover they want to discover new products. They are in search for quality products. They are also in search for socialization, etc. So they appreciate physical store, but they also buy online when necessary, when it's good for them. Next slide, please. About another set of results. It confirms regarding the links with travel behavior. Specifically, our two research confirmed the very complex links between online shopping and travel behavior that have been shown by previous research. So this very complex link is, in particular, it's the complementarity between online and in-store shopping. Online consumers still go to physical store, as I said before, but the nature, the location, and also the frequency with which they go to physical store is changing in order to better accommodate people's needs. For instance, e-grocery users still go to supermarkets, but in general, they go less frequently than before. So as a result, there is no simple decrease in shopping trips, but we observe various and complex changes regarding the destination, the distances, the schedules, and the transport modes used to go shopping. In particular, our data show that some e-grocery users tend to buy more in local shops and then reduce car use. But on the other hand, other consumers, especially the central city inhabitants, were not used to go to supermarkets before practicing click and pick up, now use their car to pick up their orders. So we observe more car use in this second example. Now, Jean-Daniel, it's your turn regarding the US.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Leslie. So the work I'm going to present is actually nicely complementing the work that was conducted in France, and we find a number of similar conclusions. So it's based on two studies, one that is essentially completed. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the first one is based on data from the 2017 National Household Travel Survey. So very clearly pre-COVID. And for that survey, we analyzed the question highlighted in green on the slide. So in the past 30 days, how many times did you purchase something online and have it delivered? Okay, so that's a question we analyzed. So this is a very large data set. As you can see, it collected roughly data from 130,000 households in the US that took almost 1 million trips over a number of months in 2016, 2017. So what we did in this study, we relied on propensity score matching, which is a quasi-experimental approach that enables us to infer causation. And we were focusing on the impact of the frequency of online shopping on the number of activities that people were doing during their day, and also on VMT and how many miles they traveled. Okay, so that's our treatment variables, the frequency of online shopping by households. Our dependent variables are the number of trips and distance traveled, either miles for all purposes or miles by car or motor vehicles. And then our control variables are a wide-ranging set of socioeconomic variables. Next slide, please. So we don't need to spend too much time. This is just to tell you for what purpose, how people essentially spent their time and how they traveled among our respondents. You can see that shopping is important, but working at home, of course, I mean, activities at home or going to work are also important activities. So we try to analyze substitution effects between shopping online and other activities. That's why I'm presenting this slide, but it's better explained in the paper that goes with this study. Next slide. So what are our findings? Well, surprisingly, people who do a lot of online shopping tend to travel more, but this is highly dependent on the density of the area where they live. Okay, so that goes back to what Anne and Leslie were describing, that there is a complex relationship between online shopping and travel. There is no simple story that we can tell. There's no monotonic relationship. And there is also a substitution effect. So only a fraction of the miles, the extra miles that people are traveling when they do a lot of online shopping is actually spent on shopping. And it represents only a small increase in travel for shopping. So in a way, it's a good thing, but it's a bad thing overall, right? Because the hope was that more online shopping would help decrease VMT, which in turn would help us decrease energy use and contributions to greenhouse gases, right? That's one of the reasons why people were hoping that online shopping would be beneficial. We also have a day of the week effect, right? This is complicated by the frequency of online shopping. So the paper kind of explains better the complex relationship between the two. Next slide, please. So compared to so we always have a comparison group here in this study, right? And the comparison group is people with households who have a low frequency of online shopping. So what we found is that medium and high frequency households consistently have more activities where they shop, buy meals, exercise, and work from home. So online shopping, because it enables people to shop when it's convenient for them, enables them to undertake more activities, okay? There's also a difference between weekday and weekends and population densities. In fact, the impact on travel is largest in lower density areas, right? It enables, well, we'll explain why people travel more. It's medium in medium density areas, and in fact, there's no change in travel in high density areas like New York. I understand Professor Conway is in New York, right? So in New York, in Manhattan, you don't have this effect, but you have this effect maximized in more rural areas where people have to travel a lot to shop. Next slide. Thank you. So why is e-shopping on average associated with more travel, right? That may seem counterintuitive. So one key reason is that we have to remember that not all goods are the same. And when we buy online, excuse me, we are missing on some important information. When I buy fresh food, for example, I like to smell what I'm buying, to touch it, to look at the consistency. I'm thinking about fruit and vegetable, that kind of thing. So for experience goods, that also includes garments and so on, clothing, people still need to kind of go to stores and see what they are buying, see and touch and smell, you name it. Okay, so people may shop online more, but in some cases they are still going to go to stores and try on different products, and then maybe once they are convinced that a specific product meets their needs, they will buy it online. Okay, and then the second reason, and that's a very important reason why more e-shopping is associated with more travel, is that at least in the US, people who buy a lot online tend to return a lot online, unfortunately. So on average, if you do an in-store purchase, you return 5 to 10% of what you buy in terms of value. But it's much higher, several times higher for online purchases. It's not unusual for people to order 3 or 4 times what they really need, maybe to look at different colors, maybe slightly different sizes, knowing that they will return most of what they bought online. Okay, and this is facilitated by the fact that many stores offer free returns. So people don't have to think twice about returning items. And the value of returns may soon exceed $1 trillion per year. So it's actually a big problem for online shopping. Next slide. Okay, so what could we do to reduce VMT from online shopping? So this is critically linked to urban planning and to zoning. So one way would be to reduce how far people have to travel to return items or to pick up items, of course, right? So in the US, at least in my part of the world, we have segregated land uses. Areas are zoned uniquely for residential use or for commercial use or industrial use, but it's more unusual to have mixed land use. So I know that in other countries such as China or South Korea, for example, you have, it's much more common to have mixed land use, which helps reduce how far people have to travel to pick up items they ordered online when these are not delivered to their house, or to return items. And then the second recommendation is more futuristic, and it has to do with the development of virtual reality tools. So this is actually not science fiction. A number of, or fantasy, a number of big retailers are developing tools, virtual reality tools so that customers can experience from the comfort of their home what products are going to look like if they wear them or if they purchase them and place them in their home. So I'm thinking, for example, about Neiman Marcus. They have Memory Mirror, which shows a 360 view of you if you decide to try on a new outfit, or IKEA that is experimenting with a virtual reality showroom that enables customers to explore what a piece of furniture would look like in their house. Okay, so I think we are suggesting that these tools should be more ubiquitous, and maybe there should be some public funding initially to level the playing field so that smaller retailers would also have access to them. Okay, all right, next slide. So this is one of the studies. There is a second study that we started based on a survey that was conducted in May, at the end of May 2021, by Ipsos for my research group. Okay, so this it focuses on the impact of COVID on how people work and buy food. Okay, so here we're going to focus on food shopping. By the way, food shopping in the US is not as developed. I mean, online food shopping is not as developed as you may expect. E-grocery represented less than 4% of grocery sales in 2019, so just before the pandemic. So why is that? Well, it's expensive to do that well. It requires investments. And then it may not always be convenient. And that's why in France, for example, that's my understanding, and these are the results that Anne was presenting earlier, click and pick is popular because you don't waste time in the supermarket. You just pick up your groceries when they are ready to be picked up. Okay, so our question was, how did COVID-19 affect food shopping in California? And what could happen, what is likely to happen when the pandemic is over? Next slide. So again, we asked Ipsos to conduct the survey on our behalf. We used a probability, a panel, an online panel. So that's a convenience of online surveying while retaining the statistical representativeness of the respondents. And so the survey was conducted in English and Spanish. We have over 1,000 respondents. Next slide. And so I'm just going to present preliminary results. So we asked people how they were shopping for food before, during, and well, after. We don't know. We asked people to speculate about what may happen after COVID. We thought in May that we were done, but apparently we're not. So here for in-person grocery shopping, you can see that Californians overwhelmingly go to stores in person, right, to shop for their food, right? And what happened with COVID is that it decreased the frequency at which people were going to stores, but people kept going to stores, right? What is kind of remarkable is that there was no drastic shift in how people were shopping in person for groceries. The percentage of Californians who stopped going to grocery stores is just 5.9% during COVID versus 4.9% before. In fact, many stores in California, even in my area, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was remarkable. They were almost empty for a while, right? And during COVID, I went shopping regularly because I enjoy cooking, and stores were busy. And one of the reasons is that people could not go to restaurants. Many restaurants had to close. So in fact, they ended up purchasing more from grocery stores. And if you look at the business reports from that sector, they did very well during the pandemic. People bought a lot more. Maybe they did not go as often in person to buy groceries, but when they went, they bought more, okay? So what can we expect after the pandemic? Well, the graph kind of illustrates that we're almost going back to normal. And in fact, the percentage of Californians who are saying they will never go to a grocery store after the pandemic is even lower than it was before. So maybe people are missing the social interactions that they enjoy when they go to a store, even a grocery store. You have to know, of course, that stores here, well, it's a little bit like Carrefour, maybe it's smaller, but you can buy almost everything, right? It's not just a grocery shop, not just groceries. Next slide. We also asked, of course, about online ways of buying groceries. So we focused on two alternatives. The first one was you buy online and your purchases are delivered to your home. And the second one is click and pick, which was described by Anne, for which she has extensive results. The beauty of Anne's study is that they have detailed information about the motivations of buyers. I don't have that, unfortunately, right? It's a standard survey, so it was much faster. But in any case, I think our work is nicely complementary. So what did we find here? So first of all, for both e-grocery and click and pick, the percentage of Californians who never use these services is still very high. The impact of the pandemic is that it pushed a number of people to experiment with both e-grocery and click and pick, right? If you focus on the red vertical bar on both graphs, it went down and during the pandemic, but it's not as drastic as we could expect, right? The percentage of Californians who never used e-grocery before the pandemic was 68.5%. It went down to 59.6. So it's a substantial gain and it's statistically significant, but I was expecting more. Most of this gain is going to be kept after the pandemic, but there is a little bit of a rebound effect, right? Some people who experience e-grocery, in fact, are thinking that they may not use it after the pandemic. Click and pick actually appears to be more popular, and basically all the gains that were obtained during the pandemic are going to be kept, and more people even are thinking about relying on click and pick after the pandemic, right? So you see it goes down. So before the pandemic, more than 78% of Californians were never using it. After it goes down to 62%, 62.7%. And the reason is probably has to do with the convenience of that approach. So I know we are running out of time, so let's move on to the next slide. So conclusion and future research needs. So as Anne and Leslie highlighted, we need better data. So my understanding is that in France, we need data with more location information if we want to make a link with land use, although this is very difficult for privacy reasons. In the US, we are fortunate. We have access to location. For California, I actually know where people live and work and shop. But our surveys are too concentrated on one day. As Leslie highlighted, we need information about several days to paint a better picture. And we need to have a combination of data on travel and time use. Okay, so we know that this area is rapidly evolving, right? So the conclusions we presented are probably going to change, and we can have a look at the future, so to speak, by looking at what's happening in other countries, such as China and especially South Korea, where online shopping is much more developed even than in Europe, and definitely more in the US. So complicating all of this, right? You have changes in the way people work with telework. So that gives people more time. And so we don't quite know at this point how they are going to use this time. Maybe they are going to travel more. And that's what we observed to a small extent with the 2017 NHTS. You give people more time, well, they're going to use it the best way they can think of according to their preferences. So maybe they're going to travel more, defeating our hope that online activities would reduce travel. So we need to, in a nutshell, to conclude, we need to understand more closely the trade-offs within households. We need better data. And I think it would be great to continue working and comparing what's happening in different parts of the world definitely comparing what's happening in France and in the US, and also in China, South Korea, and other Asian countries. Thank you very much.
So thank you. I guess I'm going to start off with just talking about the logistics side of the equation in New York City, and then I'll turn it over to Laetitia, who will speak about, I guess, similar issues in Paris. So, so that it's great to follow on that presentation from the researchers before me, because I think it leads, there's less explanation I have to do on kind of what's changing on the consumer side that's driving the changes in logistics. So I'm going to skip that slide about New York. So first, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were a number of trends that were driving the logistics activities happening in cities as a function of e-commerce. So there was growth of about 17% annually. These are US estimates in terms of sales, and the delivery activity associated with those e-commerce sales was growing at about the same rate. There was growth in on-demand services. So if we were having this discussion 5 or 10 years ago, a fast delivery would be within a week or something. I would say prior to the pandemic, 1 to 2 days has become standard with Amazon Prime and other similar services. What does that mean for the organization of logistics? In terms of warehousing, it causes basically two opposite impacts on the way that warehouses are organized. So first, it leads to re-centralization of small-scale warehouses. So if you're going to guarantee delivery within 30 minutes or an hour in Manhattan, your warehouse has to be located in Manhattan. You can't have a warehouse that's on the other side of the Lincoln Tunnel. It's just not possible to make that type of speed of delivery. So we saw this growth of very small scale warehouses right in the center of the city. At the other end of that spectrum is just the overall growth and volume of goods that are moving leads to the need for larger and larger distribution centers. And in centralized urban areas, it's very difficult to obtain the land necessary to construct those large-scale facilities. So we see warehousing also pushing away from the center, further out away from the city. And so the graphic at the bottom right of my screen just shows sort of a map in New York City. The gray area there is the 5 boroughs of New York City. You can see the locations of sort of where we typically would have warehousing in the city is where the black warehouses are shown. These two trends are the other red warehouses being added. So right in the middle of the city, and then far away, and as far away as Western Pennsylvania, which is, 75 to 100 miles away from the city. Other changes that were happening is growth in omni-channel retail models. Again, probably the best example of this is Amazon purchasing Whole Foods. So Amazon purchased Whole Foods so that they can essentially purpose Whole Foods retail stores as also distribution centers from which they can conduct online e-grocery deliveries. And along with this growth in very centralized warehousing, as well as these omni-channel retail models, we began to see more growth in the use of e-bikes and cargo bikes for last mile distribution. So from delivery, either from those centralized warehouses or from the retail stores to home consumers. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, a couple of things happened that really affected the way that shopping occurred. So this graphic is from the New York City Department of Health. It just shows kind of the progression of COVID-19, the first 2 waves in New York City. The critical points that we're interested in are that statewide stay-at-home order, which was issued at the end of March in 2020, and then the reopenings following the first phase. Essentially, for the spring of 2020, all non-essential retail stores were shut down, so you could not shop in store, which forced a lot of shift into e-commerce. In early June, those retail stores were permitted to reopen, but only for curbside or in-store pickup. So it essentially mandated click and collect during that period until in-store retail could actually reopen. So why is this important? Because it forced a lot of those retailers to develop e-commerce solutions that didn't necessarily have them before, and those are going to outlast the pandemic. We also had indoor dining shut down for much of 2020, even through the summer of 2020, which means that delivery of prepared food also became increasingly critical for dining, which one provided, access to food, but also was a mechanism by which local residents could support local businesses that were shut by the pandemic. So there was sort of a local support interest in doing that. So, so what changed during the pandemic in terms of logistics? I think our previous speakers have already covered this kind of growth in online shopping that's occurred in both countries. This really accelerated trends that were already existing. So those urban warehouses, the number of those urban warehouses grew exponentially. Prior to the pandemic, for example, again, I know I keep referencing Amazon, but they're the behemoth in this sector. They had, some small Prime Now warehouses in the city and one large distribution center. The New York Times reported that they opened 9 new warehouses during 2020 into the early part of 2021 within the 5 boroughs of New York City. So these re-centralization and even of larger scale warehousing has been accelerated by COVID demands. That 1 to 2 hour time window has now shrunk even further. Within 2021, we've seen growth of what I would call rapid delivery services. These are no longer guaranteeing delivery within 1 to 2 hours. They're guaranteeing delivery within 15 minutes. In order to provide 15-minute delivery in a place like New York City, again, this requires very different logistics. It requires very local storage spaces, so small-scale storage spaces where a fixed set of products that can be delivered on demand are stored. It has also greatly accelerated the use of e-bikes for delivery. I will say that we do not have a handle on the actual growth rates in e-bike delivery. There is no good data source that we can use to measure the growth. But if you walk around the streets of New York City, it is very obvious that the number of e-bikes on the street is growing. And so that's a data need we need to continue to look at. The picture that you see at the bottom right, I would say, is a scaling up of the curbside micro distribution. So prior to the pandemic, I'm just going to go back 2 slides. This picture at the top right was what you would see all over the city. You see a van that offloads goods for delivery, different type of goods. Someone with hand cart or a couple of people with hand carts will arrive to this vehicle and take those and deliver them. This is what I now see in my neighborhood every Saturday morning. Those are Amazon Fresh delivery trucks. You can see those are third-party trucks that were probably leased by a third-party operator who picks up a truckload of those goods and drives into Manhattan and parks at the curbside. And there is a complex, large-scale micro-distribution operation happening at the curbside. You see people in passenger cars, pickup trucks, delivery vans, e-cargo bikes, and with hand carts who all come and pick up those goods. So this is a very informal activity. This parking space is not signed as a micro distribution center. This is literally just these trucks drive in, park at the curbside, and this scale of activity is happening. So this is something the city's trying to get a handle on in terms of how do you manage this type of operation? Because there's certainly concerns about, okay, is this operation obstructing the travel lanes? But at the same time, if this type of operation is not happening, and those were smaller vehicles driving from stop to stop making deliveries, it might actually be having a worse impact than this type of micro distribution operation. One other small thing that we saw during the pandemic was, here in New York, we have a large taxi fleet and we have a large fleet of rideshare operators, Uber and Lyft drivers. During the pandemic, much of their demand on the passenger side went away. We didn't have individuals traveling into Midtown for work. We didn't have tourists looking for those kinds of rides. And so many of those drivers actually shifted from passenger operations into delivery operations and are doing things like delivering prepared food. Why do I think this is interesting? Because I think coming out of the pandemic, we may have learned that we shouldn't be planning our passenger systems and our freight systems in isolation. We might be able to take advantage of some efficiencies if we do a better job of looking at the coordination between the two. So during the pandemic, New York, you know, all of these issues that freight planners in New York have been talking about for a decade are finally at the forefront in terms of the political priorities of the city. The extreme growth that we saw over the last 2 years has just brought this to the top of the considerations within the city council. So I just want to mention, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but just that this is very important right now in New York, and the city council has a whole slew of bills on the table that they're considering in terms of managing these logistics, including commercial loading zone reform. Our commercial loading zone requirements have not been updated since the early 1970s. When e-commerce wasn't even a thought in terms of the logistics that would be happening. Again, those micro distribution centers, looking at formalizing those, looking at better ways to manage on the commercial building side. How can we coordinate deliveries within large scale buildings where you might have multiple tenants? How can we actually build into the design of buildings, places where this logistics activity is going to happen? And then last couple things about looking at where our truck routes are and whether there might be a way to actually price the curb to recover some of the costs of the impacts of these operations. So last thing I wanted to go through is just to give you some examples of the kinds of research questions we've been trying to answer. This is very high level. And some of the data challenges that we've faced in trying to answer these questions. So what you can see on your screen is a very messy graphic, and this is intentionally messy because this is the reality of the logistics supply chains that are supporting e-commerce. What we just talked about in the first presentation is, you know, focusing at this home end and on the last mile, understanding within a city, how are people shopping and what trade-offs are happening between travel to a store versus staying home. Most of the research that's been done in e-commerce is focused on that type of activity or on location of warehouses. So we've recently done a couple of studies that tried to look at different aspects of this. These are the 3 research questions I'll go through. First is just kind of zooming in on this curb management side, thinking of the curb itself as a logistics facility. How do we manage it? How do we understand demand and see if we have the right capacity? Second is, how do we measure this e-commerce activity beyond the last mile? So not what's happening directly in the city between a warehouse and a store or a warehouse and a home. And then finally, how do we consider the trade-offs that are happening between the logistics growth and the benefits we get from logistics growth versus the negative impacts. And I do want to acknowledge that these studies, I have a lot of partners that I've been working with on these studies. My 2 PhD students, Shan Chen and Carla Tejada Lopez, my sister, who's a geographer who works with me on one of these studies, Maura. And given the focus of today's research discussion, Pierre Ascand, who was a visiting student intern from ENTPE in Lyon, who was one of the key researchers on one of these projects. So, so the first study I'm going to look at quickly is still a last mile thing. So this is where we're looking at trying to estimate parking demand. What you can see on the screen is just how difficult it is to get to, starting from how people shop and how many packages do they get delivered, converting that into how much curb space do we actually need to accommodate the demand that's associated with that. So the table you can see on your right shows the process that we followed in this study. We start from very basic survey data, where we try to relate package demands to basic income characteristics using the USPS household survey. Then once we know how many packages a week people are receiving, then we need to try to figure out, okay, how are those distributed over a week within the day? Then how are those distributed within a day over the time of day? Then on what type of vehicle are they traveling at that time of day? And then ultimately, how much curb space is required for parking that vehicle given its parking characteristics. So the data needs are extreme, right? So these are all the different types of data that we used just to answer that one question: how much curb space do we need to accommodate all the deliveries that are happening to home-based locations. We then took that predicted demand and compared it to the available supply. We had a geocoded sign text. So New York City has a database of the text of every parking sign in the city. We converted that into estimated curb lengths during specific discrete half-hour periods so that we can compare the supply and demand. Lots of data limitations. There's a lot of uncertainty. We had to do a lot of sensitivity analysis to control for all of the assumptions that we made based on these data. And there's missing information. Things like curb cuts and fire hydrants just aren't going to appear in the analysis process that we use. But doing this study allowed us to see some very obvious things that had been missing in terms of looking at how do we accommodate curbside parking for logistics. Because in the first graphic, you can see where our commercial dedicated parking is in the afternoon period. And you can see Midtown Manhattan is that green patch just south of Central Park. That's where we have a very heavy concentration of commercial activity, of dedicated commercial parking. That is based on the old way of commerce, where we expect deliveries to commercial land uses. Now, when we have deliveries actually going to residential buildings, where is the demand for these home-based deliveries? It's in the areas of the city in dark blue and purple shown on the map, which are almost the exact opposite of where the parking is. So what we can see is there's both a spatial and temporal mismatch in where we have dedicated commercial parking for traditional retail versus e-commerce. So second example is a pilot we just looked at. This is where we're trying to study literally the entire chain for e-commerce. Like I said, most of the research that has been done in e-commerce has focused in on that last mile. So we just took my PhD student as part of her dissertation, a very small sample, 140 package deliveries to a single address. This is in Chicago, the data that we used. These are the package tracking records when you order something online and you get updates from the carrier where that is at any point from when the time you deliver it until it gets delivered to your door. We wanted to see, is there any value in using this data to actually understand how goods move through the supply chain? So some limitations with the data, it was really hard to pull this data together. We had to compile individual package tracking from multiple carriers. Many of the records are missing first mile movements because they're not scanned into the system until they reach a warehouse. There's uncertainties. We don't know by what mode it's traveling at any leg. We can make assumptions about that based on speed and things like that. It's difficult to distinguish storage time versus transloading time. There's scanning errors in the technology when they scan the package at different locations. And certainly, and most critically, there's privacy concerns, both on the carrier side and the consumer side with this type of data. But even given this very small sample, we were able to extract some interesting insights that can inform when we think about logistics planning. So first, in our data set, there were 4 primary carriers, one of which was a retailer carrier, one of the other 3 of which were more traditional parcel carriers. And you can see great distinctions in the way that their supply chains are organized. For the parcel carriers, there's a lot more movement that occurs before it arrives to the region in which a delivery is ultimately made, whereas a retailer carrier has already pre-positioned the goods. When you conduct an online order, those goods are already warehoused in the region. That doesn't mean nothing happens downstream, but that's not visible in the data that we're seeing. And it's likely more efficient because they're moving goods less on a one-on-one consumer basis. We also saw a lot of variation in performance between carriers. So just that if you know how one parcel carrier operates, you know how one parcel carrier operates. They do not, there's not necessarily parity across those operators. And then finally, what we saw was when you have consumer behavior like delivery time guarantees, that's going to force the need for things like air travel in order to keep, if those goods are not pre-positioned in the region, in order to keep delivery. So the very last study that I'll mention is looking at kind of the other end of the e-commerce supply chain, which is those large-scale regional warehouses that are located more in exurban or rural areas. So this study is focused on Berks County, Pennsylvania, which is about 100 miles west of New York City. This is an area that has been historically primarily rural. There's some small urban areas within the county, but it's primarily rural. Right now, this I-78 corridor is being completely overrun with e-commerce, warehousing development, just tremendous growth because of the demands both in New York and in Philadelphia and in other large major metro areas. So what we're trying to study is in this county that is just starting to see this type of development, how can they understand the benefits that are coming from logistics development as well as the negative impacts? And those are summarized on the graphic on the screen. I won't go through them one by one. The types of data we're using to understand concerns. One is just media reports, qualitative interviews with local participants in this process. We're also using US economic census employment data to look at how employment has changed in specific tracts where warehousing growth has occurred. And finally, we haven't done it yet, but we're going to be looking at a cell phone probe data set to understand where people are working and those that work in the warehouses, where are they coming from? Because what we found, so there's some data limitations, again, bias in using media reports, timeliness of survey data, sector aggregation. In the origin destination of employment, we see sectors have to be aggregated because of the privacy concerns, especially in an area like this that's relatively rural, and limited sample sizes. But even from what we have, we're able to kind of get at important insights about the jobs being created in the logistics sector, because we can understand, one, just the scope of jobs. So if you're a county trying to determine if you should permit an e-commerce facility from developing in your area, you want to understand how many jobs is it going to create and how much tax revenue is it going to create and how much transportation demand is it going to create on your roads, potentially on your transit network, and so on. So just by mapping the census changes, we're able to understand the scale of jobs. And so you can see this is the map on the left is for a single census tract where a tremendous amount of warehousing development has grown. And this is statewide in the state of Pennsylvania, how jobs traveling to that census tract have increased. And you can see from almost the other side of the state growth. This is because of the scale from, or the geographic scope from which long distance truck drivers are actually coming to work and serve those warehouses is literally the opposite end of the state. And so this giving us some idea of where those jobs are. So that gives us insights on what types of jobs they are, which gives us insights on what kind of training might be needed to allow a local community to take advantage of the opportunities of this kind of logistics development. We can also understand, you know, the demographic characteristics of the people working in the sector, which again can help us understand where workers may be coming from, what's the quality of jobs that are being created, what is the net benefit or cost of this type of job creation. Do you want these jobs if they're in an automated warehouse versus in a standard warehouse? Those kinds of questions. So I know I've been talking for a long time. I want to turn it over to Laetitia to speak from the side in Paris.
Thanks a lot, Alison.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laetitia.
So I will now go to Paris e-commerce logistics, and there will be many similarities with New York e-commerce logistics, but also some interesting differences. I think an interesting first difference is the role of the city. The city of New York got involved when COVID happened and e-commerce developed very quickly, and the city of New York did help. The city of Paris also got involved, and one of the interesting initiatives of the municipality was the setting up of a website identifying and mapping all the local retailers that were proposing delivery. And the municipality also tried to connect these local stores developing a website and deliveries to local companies making deliveries, especially cargo cycle companies. So that was quite an interesting initiative that is actually still on. Alison mentioned rapid deliveries. And we, big difference, but in Europe, we would rather say quick commerce and quick deliveries, but that's actually the same as in New York. There's this new service of 15 minutes or less deliveries after order. So these are, this is a French service trying to develop in Europe. This is a German service trying to develop in New York and the US, in Europe and in New York, actually, I think. And this is a Turkish service. So these are the big three ones trying to develop these very new services, very no profit at the moment services, finding investors to finance these new developments, and also trying to look for dark stores, as Alison mentioned, all over the city. So very small urban facilities serving as small warehouses to pick up the products to be delivered very quickly in the neighborhoods. What happened in Paris is a huge diversification of the modes for urban deliveries. And that's before COVID, during COVID, and especially today. The diversification took on mopeds, lots of mopeds now in Paris making deliveries. That's very new from, let's say, 5 years ago. Bicycle deliveries, of course. But also the new thing is cargo cycle deliveries. And I would have said 2 years ago that it was a very marginal part of traffic for deliveries. Today, it's growing very fast. So it's an interesting new development for deliveries all over Paris. We do have data, and as all my colleagues said, we are missing data on e-commerce mobilities, but we do have some sources. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what happened because of COVID, relying on some of this data. And one of them, an interesting source of data, is registration of micro freight companies in France. So for the Paris region, you see the two numbers here. For before COVID, 24,000 new micro companies just for the Paris region, making deliveries, especially in instant deliveries such as Uber Eats and Deliveroo. These are independent companies, independent people working for this big platform for deliveries. So it's a one-person company, right? So that's why we call that micro freight companies. But the increase from 19 to 20 is amazing. In 2020, just for the Paris region, 32,000 new micro companies were created on this instant delivery market. Another type of data that we can use are data from the big parcel delivery companies, and they do provide some approximations of what they are delivering and what their competitors are delivering. So I took these data from what people from La Poste Group said about all the B2C parcel deliveries in Paris. Again, you see a huge increase in parcels delivered just for the B2C segment of the market of parcels. So I just wanted to mention these new sort of sources for data. Another interesting development in Paris, I mentioned that before in psychologistics. I want to insist on that. You walk in the streets of Paris today, you see lots of these big containers on bicycles, I would say, making deliveries that are actually quite voluminous today. And one of the main advantages of these new services is the use of the new bike lanes. Many more bike lanes were implemented in Paris before COVID and during COVID. and we actually even call them Corona lanes. But so they did provide a very important competitive advantage for these companies. And increasingly the containers are big, and they now quite compete with small vans in terms of the volume that they can carry. Big companies, as well as small startups, are using these new cargo cycles. A very important development in Paris related to e-commerce deliveries, logistics, is urban warehouses. There's been a lot of activity trying to find urban warehouses, from micro ones, very small ones, to rather big ones, up to 10,000 square meters. There's been recycling of local shops that got out of business, lots of recycling of car parks, especially underground car parks. I give you here an example, an interesting example of on the bottom left of my slide. You can see below the urban ring road of Paris, the use of what was before just an empty space, right? It has been turned into a very sophisticated urban warehouses for e-commerce deliveries of fresh goods and groceries. So electric trucks coming in, using the ring road, and only cargo bikes and electric vans getting out and making the final deliveries. So, but the interesting thing is the use of this former empty space below the ring road. And another one here on the right is the use of a gas station. So the gas station is not operated anymore, and it will be turned into another of these logistics warehouses within Paris. There are lots of examples of that. What has been continuing and actually developing is a very specific way for French people, and especially Parisian people, to get their deliveries, which is the use of pickup points. We have 4 big networks of pickup points in France, and you see here the numbers for the region of Paris and the metropolitan area of Paris and the city of Paris. I just want to mention these numbers because it shows that these networks now are quite well developed. These pickup points are mostly in shops, in stores. They are not automated lockers, so that's quite a big difference with other countries. In France, the use of the local stores serving as pickup stores. So very professional, very developed, very competitive for networks, and a huge use by people living in the big cities in France. So that has been confirmed in the past 2 years. But the new thing is actually automated lockers catching up, and that's very new. French people did not use much automated lockers, but now there are 2 networks, one from La Poste group and the other one just Amazon Lockers. They have been developing very quickly within the big cities. So here you can see the map of all the automated lockers inside Paris and just outside of Paris. Huge new development. Another interesting development, and one I can report on in detail because we have been making surveys in my team. That's the way instant deliveries are changing jobs in Paris to make deliveries. So gig workers, instant deliveries. I just want to mention 2 things here. One is the very strong impact of the pandemic on the types of jobs and the type of people who enter that sort of activity. Instant delivery for Uber Eats, Deliveroo, Glovo, and all these delivery platform companies. So the impact of COVID is students returned on the job because they lost opportunities in other sectors, of course. So many more students than the year before worked on the job. So back on part-time jobs, as before the trend was that it had become a full-time job, right? But now, because of COVID, part-time jobs came back on these activities. Impact of COVID was also very strong on income. And actually, so many more people registered to work for these companies that overall, the average income was reduced. And they also mentioned in the survey that their working conditions had worsened because of the pandemic. So there's a strong difference between the survey we did in early 20 and the survey we did in early 21. Another interesting element I wanted to show you today on these instant delivery jobs is the way they use many much more diverse types of vehicles. So before, that was bicycle based type of activity for deliveries. Today, bicycles are just a minority of the modes. Mopeds have taken over. One big also increase is the use of electric shared bikes from the municipal service of bike sharing. And also what emerged in 21 is the use of cars that did not show at all in the previous surveys. So instant deliveries with gig workers using now cars within Paris, which is quite surprising because of the congestion in Paris, but they're still using cars because they are going faster than using their bicycle. And you need to go fast because you need to do a lot of deliveries to earn the same amount of money. And what is interesting in the case of Paris and France is that actually using a moped, using a car is actually not possible considering the French legislation, because they are using a motor vehicle and they would need to be licensed, which they are not. So we have now half of the gig workers making instant deliveries in Paris that are using modes that they are not supposed to use. Quite an interesting development. I was telling you that lots of these delivery workers are using the bike sharing scheme of Paris. And actually, so you see on the photo here, a very typical situation in Paris, a delivery worker waiting to get an order and using a bike share, a shared bike. But it will also give us an opportunity, and that's something we are going to do in the team, is to use artificial intelligence to identify the use of bike sharing for deliveries. And we hope to be able, because of this new method of collecting data, to monitor indicators such as the number of deliveries, the routes, and of course the pickup and the delivery points. So just another way of finding new sources of data for these urban deliveries. I will just finish with a very broad map, actually, on warehousing. But I thought it was quite an interesting way of confirming what Alison said about ex-urban warehousing, Pennsylvania for New York. In the case of Paris, the same phenomenon is happening. Lots of decentralized developments of very big warehouses, including fulfillment centers for big e-retailers, not just outside of Paris, but further away, 50, 100 kilometers away from the center of the city. And another thing that you can see on the map is the color blue here. And that's the first thing that it happens overall in the real estate for logistics in France, is that there's actually not so much concentration in the very big markets, which are Paris, Lyon, Lille, and Marseille. So that's the green area, and that's where all the development used to happen before. But today, the blue area shows that there's, for the first time, a reversal of the trend and a development in the medium-sized cities of France. So why is that? Why all this new type of development of real estate for logistics around the medium-sized cities is because of e-commerce and the necessity to be ready to deliver faster. So e-commerce and the new trends in fast deliveries, quick deliveries, instant deliveries, rapid deliveries, makes it important for the logistics real estate to be ready and to be around, even for the very big fulfillment centers, to be around all the cities around the country and not only just the big market. And I'm finished. Thank you very much.